Hello and welcome. My name is Gilad Berenstein, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the AI and Faith podcast. On this podcast, we bring together experts from our community and thought leaders from around the world so that together we can learn the key lessons required to build a world where AI benefits humanity and all of us individually.
Whether there is something sacred about being judged by a human being. I mean, you wanted me to sort of split up the roles here, because there is obviously the question that judges that are AIs may be able to judge more accurately than human beings. But is there something essential about being judged by a human being? That's a question.
One of the key objectives of the AI and Faith podcast, and a core part of our organizational mission, is to help the people and organizations bringing AI into our world do so in a way that benefits from the great wisdom and learnings derived from our past, from our faith traditions, religious teachings, and philosophies. One way we further this aim is by taking the time to think deeply about specific elements of our world that are being impacted by the great commoditization of AI, and through the wisdom of our community to share those key lessons with the world. Today, our arena of focus is AI's impact on the law, along with the many ways the law will impact AI. So let's get started. Thank you all for joining us today. To kick things off, please introduce yourself and tell us a tiny little bit about what you do. And Ben will have you kick us off.
Hi, I'm Ben Dynkin, contributing fellow at AI and Faith now for a few years. I'm also the head of AI governance for global markets at Barclays and an adjunct professor at City College, where I teach tech ethics and cybersecurity law.
Hi, I'm Barry Dynkin. I'm a cybersecurity and AI attorney. I'm also contributing fellow at AI and Faith. Also work at the American Cybersecurity Institute, which I founded as a cybersecurity and technology policy think tank. And I also teach at Grove School of Engineering at City College of New York, where I teach classes on technology ethics and cybersecurity law and policy.
Hi, I'm Harris Bohr. I'm a barrister. That's a trial advocate, for those who don't know, in the areas of commercial litigation and international arbitration. I'm also a rabbi, and I'm a research fellow and lecturer in the areas of religion and philosophy and AI and related subjects. And I also happen to be the chair of AI and Faith, so I'm very excited.
Absolutely. And he's our returning champion. It's great to have you back on the podcast with us. As I was preparing for this conversation, I wanted to break this topic down into a few subtopics so we could examine them from a few different perspectives with some depth. And the subtopics I was thinking about are AI's impact on the practice of law, AI's impact on key legal principles and rights, and then finally, the law's impact on artificial intelligence and the future of society. So just a few simple topics for us to explore this morning. So to get us started, Ben, sitting here in early 2026, how has AI impacted the practice of law so far?
I mean, it's been, I would argue, one of the more disruptive technologies in the practice of law that we've seen, certainly in all of our careers, and probably going back a good deal further. It has touched every facet, from core fundamental questions like where does privilege exist, what kinds of conversations are privileged, how do we solicit and get legal advice, all the way to how do attorneys use technology responsibly, how do they meet their responsibilities for client confidentiality, client competence, due diligence. AI has just cropped up systemically across the legal field.
Absolutely. And Barry, anything you have to add on where we're using it today? And then any thoughts you have about where we may see AI in the legal profession over the coming months and years?
Yeah, so I think it's already started playing out for both good and for ill. Excuse my voice a little bit, getting over COVID. So on the positive side, I think it's increased the ability of attorneys to provide effective services to their clients. It's been a kind of a force multiplier in a way probably few previous technologies have been. On the ill side, a lot of attorneys have been using it irresponsibly. There have been, numerous high-profile cases in the United States, including one of a judge, actually, of lawyers who have misused AI, who have submitted documents to courts that were authored by AI that had glaring factual and legal inaccuracies present in them. So this profession has embraced it without developing adequate competencies and standards to ensure that it's used in a responsible way to more effectively provide advocacy and services for clients to better come to quality work product rather than to, in some cases, avoid effort and be used in a manner that risks client interests in immaterial ways. I think on the near-term horizon, one of the most interesting phenomena will be the question of what it does for demand for legal services. So as lawyers are able to provide services more efficiently, and there have been some early anecdotal studies that say that it could be up to an order of magnitude more efficient at providing services, that you may be able to do 5 to 10 times more work per unit of time in the provision of client services. Will that decrease opportunities for the practice of law or increase them? I think the question really depends on the demand saturation for legal services in the market. I personally believe there's actually a great deal of unmet demand. There's a great deal of people who are in need of legal services who can't afford them at current market prices. Even if it lowers the price per unit of labor, it can still significantly raise the compensation. As a rough example, if a lawyer can do 4 times more work per hour and the hourly fee doubles, the client is still getting half the price per legal services that they were before. And perhaps at half the price, there will be actually twice as much work that needs to be done because there is a lot of unmet demand of people who need services who can't currently afford them. Small businesses, smaller parties who are slipping through the cracks in the current system.
Yeah, absolutely. And Harris, let's jump across the pond. What are you seeing on your side of
Yeah.
the world?
Okay. Across the pond, I mean, law firms definitely seeing them developing their own AI, particularly LLMs, to draft documents. I mean, I'm a litigator, so I look at it through that lens. To draft documents, to review documents for litigation purposes, and to use AI for legal research. And I suspect that this is going to increase, and there's going to be more use of AI for drafting, and also for case strategy, like predictive technology. Will this judge find for me? On these documents, what are my chances of success? That's an area which, lawyers have traditionally advised upon, but perhaps turning to AI will be something that we'll see going forward. Also seeing pressure from the courts, the English courts, to use AI. They're very overworked, particularly in the criminal justice system. We have thousands of cases which have not been heard. So there's a huge pressure to do something about that. One of them is to cut jury trials, which we have. The other is to increase the use of AI. And in fact, there are commercial judges, heads of court, etc., who have been encouraging the use of AI. I agree with what Barry says about the benefits and helping more people. What we may see is a kind of golden period where law firms can still charge high rates for the work until people cotton on that it's now being done quicker through the use of AI. One major concern, which I see here and I've heard from clients around the world, is in terms of training of junior lawyers. I mean, as the Dynkin brothers will know and have experienced, just like I have, as junior lawyers, you kind of trawl through masses of documents or proofreading, and it all feels very boring. But actually, you're picking up and learning from that exercise, and that's something that junior lawyers may not have to do. And will life be more exciting for them? Maybe. Will they be trained adequately? That's the big question.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
sorry, but I just wanted to both build on Harris's point and take it in a slightly different direction. First, I think we have to consider that there is no monolithic concept of a lawyer. There are a huge number of differently situated people, different skill sets, different exposure and comfort with AI. And when we think about creating rules and encouraging use, we have to try to embed some nuance or basic competencies in. Because there are people today who are getting off the shelf subscriptions to chat gpt or some other large language model and just basically handing over the thought process to them, and that is a very problematic usage. Whereas if you have specialized use cases, specialized tools, carefully developed processes and sophistication, you can elicit great value from AI. So it's not law and AI. It's lots of considerations around who and what level of competency do you have. And I think what we'll see is a kind of K-shaped, I think that's the term of use that everyone is, using across the world these days, but this K-shaped world of those people who are adopting, embracing, learning AI, and those people who might be using it as a kind of secondary accoutrement or not understanding the risks incumbent on that usage, and they're going to see negative outcomes. And in that kind of K-shaped model, one of the things that I think Harris has hit on that is deeply resonant to me is when we train young lawyers, a lot of the things that we ask language models to do today, particularly in the legal field, initial drafts, thinking through case strategy, these are projects that are absolutely essential for young lawyers to understand what the practice of law is. I don't think it's an accident that law is called a practice. It is something that we have to learn how to do, build muscle memory on. It's not that a, senior lawyer who knows everything, has all the experiences, can't just take a tool and start working much better. We will put ourselves in a very vulnerable position when those people start retiring and there's not a generation of people who have had years of experience building that muscle memory in what they have to do. So deeply concerned about where that divergence exists in the legal field.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that comes up all the time in kind of running of businesses. And I always use the analogy that no CEO wants to pay for an accounting associate. Every CEO wants an accounting partner at a firm level type thinker to help them think about M&A or transactions or whatever. And of course, the hard question you hit on is how does one become a partner level thinker if they were never an associate level thinker, which I think is one of these difficult questions. Now, we've touched on a little bit already kind of some of the key ethical questions and considerations in this realm, and we'll have Harris kick us off on this question here. And I'm curious both, what are some of the key ethical considerations we should be thinking about with AI in the practice of law? And I'm also curious if you think about these differently between clients, lawyers, and judges. Like, is it the use case that makes the ethical difference, or is it the role you play in the court that makes the ethical difference?
Okay, let me try and sort of deal with this as succinctly as I can. I mean, ethical considerations. I mean, you have data protection, of course, right? Especially if people are using large language models, if they're using the standard ChatGPT and their information is training models, there are going to be privacy and data protection issues around that. Many firms now have their own sealed systems. That's difficult for smaller firms. Hallucinations. There was a mention earlier of the US case. There was a case called Mata versus Avianca, where fake authorities were cited. There have been similar cases in England. There's also issue of transparency. So, for example, it's always been the case here, well, for many years, that if you use an automatic system for going through disclosure in a litigation trial, in other words, providing documents or discovery, I think you call it in the US, for trial, you have to tell the other side that you're using that. So transparency around the use of AI is an issue. But actually, I think, these are many of the ethical issues that are cited, but I think there are actually some deeper issues. And that is, this touches upon our topic for today, and that is query whether there is something sacred about being judged by a human being. I mean, you wanted me to sort of split up the roles here, because there is obviously the question that judges that are AIs may be able to judge more accurately than human beings. But is there something essential about being judged by a human being? That's a question. Then also the impact of society on not engaging with the law intellectually. I mean, we've spoken about training of junior lawyers, but in terms of how to get them up to speed. But actually, there's a deeper issue here, which I think religion is well qualified to speak to, and that is about the actual act of engaging with the law and the worth of that in and of itself. And what you may have is sort of a surface engagement whereby AI does the work and we just check it. And where does that leave us as human beings? And what is the impact on society as a whole of that when people aren't embedded in the law, living with the law, debating the law? Because remember, particularly within our religion, within Judaism, law is a devotional exercise. And then you've got the question of automation bias, the idea that if AI comes up with a suggestion, we're inclined to accept that, just simply by the virtue of the fact that we trust that the AI knows much more than us and has digested more information and documentation. And so how do we resist that? And does that impact us or our ability to choose freely? So those are some of the things. I hope I've kind of given you the distinction that you wanted between the different roles. But I'll leave
Absolutely.
it there.
And
Yeah.
Ben, Barry, anything to add to the distinction there?
Excuse me, I have a few thoughts to add there. One is that automation bias is something that is much more powerful than most people realize, and might be the most effective route at vitiating true human engagement and thought. That, each time you see the AI get a decision right, you become more and more deferential to it. The perception that most people have is that if there's meaningful human oversight, meaningful human control, it is still a human-driven process. And in practice, that may be more of a fiction than a truth. Even if humans get to make that final call, even if there's a judge who actually makes the ruling, if he has an advisory system that he relies on, and when he first gets it, he probably is going to provide a lot of skepticism, a lot of oversight, a lot of real engagement beyond just rubber stamping and ratifying the advice that system gives him. But if time and time again, he sees that his wisdom is correct, and predictably, let's say, in an actual case, a advisory system, the likelihood, and this is an actual case that happened, that was suspended for good reasons of bias, where it ought to have been suspended, but let's say somebody honed that technology and predicts the likelihood of recidivism much more accurately than any human judge can, which is likely going to be the case pretty soon if it isn't already. How much true review, how much true skepticism, how much true exercise of human judgment will remain once the judge has accustomed himself to deferring almost completely to that AI's recommendation? That the incentives to do so won't really exist, because if the judge wrongfully overrides the AI, he's going to be a really unfortunate news story, and he's going to, in the US, most state trial level judges are elected, so that's going to be a campaign ad in his next election. So the pressure to both intellectually and structurally become a rubber stamp for a system that is putatively an advisory system under the actual substantive control of a human judge making the final decision might rapidly devolve into a de facto handing over of the essence of the judicial process, the essence of practice of human judgment and human oversight to that system in a manner that is completely opaque and non-transparent, which in some ways is more concerning than doing it forthrightly.
So, Barry, I agree with your points there. I think it raises a much more fundamental question about what the law is, which is to say, when there is a dispute, when there is a legal process that happens, when a judge comes to elucidate the law, do we presume that there is a correct answer? Is the law a scientific process designed to get to rightness? Or is it a kind of legal realist approach that applies social convention and judicial discretion and all these things? And ultimately, I think there's a balance between the two. I don't think there's an absolute there. But to push back on you slightly, if we have an AI that is capable of analyzing massive bodies of law, the entire corpus and history that we have, and applying it in a teleological method to get to a kind of discretely correct answer, why wouldn't we want that? I'm not concerned when my NASA scientists use calculators to calculate, lunar trajectories. There's a scientifically correct answer there. And again, I'm trying to take the absolutist perspective to be the devil's advocate. I do think that there is something deeply human about the judicial process as well, and we want to protect that. But at its core, particularly, I know we have an American British perspective on this podcast here, where we are common law jurisdictions that deeply feel that scientific method and that evolution and precedent and analysis. And that is something that I think we have to reckon with. I think judges more often in the human process are liable to get things wrong. So the question that I would pose for this group and for our listeners here, who's the guardrail and who's the car? Perhaps we need human guardrails for AI judicial processes, not AI guardrails for human processes. Maybe we need to kind of shake up the ecosystem a little bit to help us scale and address really systemic, there's no other way to say it than failings in our judicial system. Harris brought up a few of them. You can look in America, for example, at our reliance on plea bargaining. Also is a great illustration of that we are taking off ramps from a judicial system that's overburdened, under-resourced, and under-equipped to handle the volume of cases before it. So we push settlement and we push plea bargains. And AI might be able to expedite that and actually give people resolution under the law rather than from alternative methods.
I love where this conversation is going. And I just want to add, so far we're talking about the people who are party to the case. But, my mom was on the jury of a very violent crime, and it was a completely unpleasant experience for her to have to relive these really awful things that happened in this case. So there's also the question of not only the impact on the litigants, on the judge, on the lawyers, but on the rest of us who have to participate in the system. Now, this is a perfect transition to continue this conversation, moving from the practice of law really to the key legal principles that we want to talk about, how AI is impacting them and how we need to think about. So, as our audience knows, we're living through this time that I call the great commoditization. And exactly as Barry said, we are going to be introducing AI into more aspects of our lives, and people will begin to rely on those things. So I think it's very important to ask, what are the ethical guardrails and what can we learn from our own faith traditions in order to bring that wisdom about to make sure that we try to get these things right? So the first question, I want to spend a few more minutes on juries, which is something that we began with, and we'll start with you, Barry. And my main question is, what's the role of a jury? And if the role is fact-finding, as we spoke about earlier, can't AI do that better without the collateral impact on the people on the jury who have to go through these often unpleasant experiences?
That's exactly where I wanted to head in response to Ben's question as well. And permit me a moment to discuss a little bit of common law history of the development of the jury system and Bushell's case. So there was a famous leading English case in the 17th century, actually involving William Penn, the founder of the colony of Pennsylvania, where a jury factually found him and another defendant guilty of the factual elements that would lead to a conviction on a charge of unlawful assembly, but then refused to find him guilty of unlawful assembly. So the judge, by this point in the development of the common law, the principle that a conviction for a felony required a jury to actually convict was well established, but the judge sought to compel the jury to convict because they had found the factual elements necessary for the crime, and nonetheless the jury refused to find the defendants guilty of the crime. So the judge held that the jurors were guilty of contempt of court, and the jurors actually sued the judge for writ of habeas corpus, and a superior English court held that the jurors could not be compelled to deliver a verdict against their views and could not be punished for refusing to do so. So it created a very interesting asymmetry based on the principle of lenity in the law, where a judge can find non obstante verdicto, which means overturn a jury verdict, if a jury finds a defendant guilty, but the judge views that they did not have the requisite evidence to properly be able to do so. So if a jury gets inflamed and finds a defendant guilty, but the judge views that the evidence doesn't substantiate the guilt of the defendant, he can overturn that verdict of guilt. But if the jury finds the factual elements necessary to have convicted the defendant and then refuses to do so, the judge has no recourse. The judge has to accept that jury's verdict of not guilty and let the person go, even though it's patently obvious that the factual elements are met. So, on one hand, theoretically, the jury is a dispassionate finder of fact. But at least in the criminal law context, the jury in the Anglo-American common law is something more. It is a representation of the mores, the values, the ethics of the community. And that's why the principle of a jury of your peers is so important. it might be very plausible that a panel of experts would be more effective at dispassionately finding facts. You could have people who are really good at, telling this guy telling the truth or not. You could have experts on the plausibility of different sorts of narratives. So you could imagine perhaps a system that is more effective at judging truth claims effectively. Certainly most jurisdictions in the world have some sort of system to that effect. But the concept of a jury of your peers having the final right of determining and passing judgment on your guilt or innocence is an essential safeguard of the liberty of the individual person in the common law system. And that ethic to me is essential to that intentional asymmetry, which in the common law it's often called Blackstone's ratio, but it actually goes back at least half a millennium further to Maimonides, to Rambam, that it's better that 10 guilty men should go free than that one innocent man should wrongfully have to suffer. So that is a core principle of the Jewish ethic, but is also a core principle of the common law legal philosophical ethic. And I think the concept of the jury is an essential manifestation of that idea.
That was a really awesome explanation. I really love that backstory. Now, I want to bring Harris and Ben into this as well and add one more element, which is due process. And, we can argue that AI will likely be able to review more information faster and more depth than certainly a jury will probably get to do. So if the goal of due process is to make sure that as much information is reviewed as possible and that everything comes to light, one could argue that it'd be better to have AI do some of these reviews, some of these thoughts, etc., and maybe provide an output to a jury or an output to a judge based on its analysis. So how does that fit? How does that sound philosophically? Maybe Harris, take us off and please connect it to the
Okay,
jury.
I mean, there may well be a halfway house, but really there is a dilemma which I feel quite strongly, and that is the desire to get things right. And certainly, on many legal points, there is a right or wrong answer, right? Particularly when you're talking about accuracy, truth in terms of what actually happened in a particular situation. But then this point that Barry was talking about, the notion of being judged by your peers and the involvement of the community in the process of law. One thing we haven't spoken about is this, or we haven't put it in these terms at least, the balance between justice and mercy, which in a sense is what a jury brings, the human element from lots of different angles. This is perspectivalism in terms of philosophy. The way to get at truth is to look at things from lots of different angles. And that's what a jury brings. But carried within their decision making is their own sense of mercy for the person before them. And one can debate, how much they should really bring to bear on this when they're applying cold law, black letter law. But in a sense, they're doing this almost subconsciously. They're not necessarily verbalizing it, but there was something within them, a conscience which causes them to raise certain issues within the jury room, for example, or decide one way or the other. And again, sitting that kind of thing to an AI, I would say is problematic. So you have these kind of the two issues. Now, in terms of, we mentioned, you asked me about the view from the over the pond. We in quarter 3 of 2023, I think the average hearing length of a trial disposed of in the Crown Court, which ended in a not guilty plea, I think it took 19.4 hours, right? So that's a lot of time. Now, Nick Bostrom, the sort of philosopher of AI, puts forward this notion that biological neurons operate at a peak of speed of about 200 hertz. So that's a full 7 orders of magnitude slower than a modern microprocessor. So that's how much AI can help us. And so when you factor that in, and also factor in how juries come to different views and get things wrong, there was a program on television here in the UK called The Jury, where they ran a murder trial. 2 juries looked at the same facts. One found murder and one found manslaughter. So that's the accuracy aspect. But as I say, I think it goes beyond that, and maybe the way to deal with it is have AI assist juries, but actually still allow juries to make the decisions.
Absolutely. Ben, you want anything to add?
Yeah, so a few thoughts. First, great points by Barry and Harris. I think, though, there is a real issue that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. which is we have I wouldn't go so far as to say Platonic ideal, but something resembling the Platonic ideal of due process in juries. And then there's what actually happens on the ground. And, when you think about things like mercy and humanity, I'd share a story from the late Justice Scalia very briefly. In Texas, under federal law, you have an obligation to what's called witherspoon a jury when you are taking them under consideration for a death penalty trial. It's from a case called Witherspoon, and the judge has to ask if a jurist is able to give the death penalty. In other words, if someone feels morally unable to render a death penalty verdict, they don't sit on the jury. You have to be able to give it. So a federal judge is witherspooning the jurors, asking, can you do it? And the juror responds, is the prisoner up in this jail uptown? And the judge says, yes, but what could that possibly have to do with your ability to render this verdict? And the guy says, I could make it up there on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but not any other day. And that's the attitude in some parts of a very large and diverse country. And then in other places, we have
to clarify that point, because I think it's so shocking that if you haven't heard the story before, you might not have been clear enough on what the prospective juror meant there.
Please, Barry.
What he meant when he said I can make it up there Tuesday or Thursday was he thought he was being asked, could he actually mete out capital punishment rather than could he render a verdict of capital punishment? So the juror's view was, I can make it up there on a Tuesday, Thursday.
But the point is that is the attitude in some places. In other places, we have radical opposition to the death penalty to the point where it is a non-starter. And that's a good thing on the one hand. But on the other hand, it creates a very uneven, very localized distribution of justice. And if we have decided, yes, there should be something like the death penalty, or no, there shouldn't be, I would imagine then due process should reflect what we have decided is the correct state of the law, not only what is the attitudes of specific populations. And it's a balance. We want to respect people's individuality. But again, I stress this point. If there is a correctness or an incorrectness in the law, that's what we should be striving towards. And as a final point of consideration, I would also posit we can, with proper training and fine-tuning, likely give a little bit of regional and idiosyncratic considerations to an AI. I think we paint a picture in our head on the other end of the spectrum of this Platonic kind of ideal of AI as this cold, HAL-like IBM machine that will, mete out whatever it thinks is the correct thing without any nuance or social consideration. But if you take seriously the idea of, let's say, a stochastic parrot is coined the term, well, if you give it the right population of information, it'll parrot back to us our social perspectives. So it's not that it's only going to be rigidly, defined by some abstract principles. It will reflect to us our ideals in potentially a very productive way. And I just want to clarify here. I am not in the full let's have AI replace everything camp, but I think it's important as we have this conversation for the full spectrum to kind of be represented here. And I do think, as Harris said at his final point a moment ago, there's probably middle grounds that make a lot of sense. But I think we need to understand both extremes are pretty extreme, and we want to shy away from those towards kind of moderation on all, moderate involvement of humans, moderate involvement of AIs towards some kind of productive middle.
Incredible. Now I want to move us to free speech, which is a topic that, of course, matters to many people and is a topic that I think is incredibly complex in the world of AI. The first kind of question, and Ben, we're going to have you kick us off, and then we'll bring the rest of the crew back into the conversation, is in the principles of free speech here in the United States or elsewhere, do we believe that AI bots are entitled to free speech? And to make it even a little more complicated, how does that change if the AI bot's used in different ways? Meaning, what if I say, this is my Gilad's AI PR bot that is communicating on my behalf? Does that bot now get free speech as an extension of me? Or the other way around, what if there's a bot who we don't know its ownership or its creation origin. It's just out there on the web. Maybe it's from another country. Maybe it's whatever. Does that bot get free speech? How do you think about that?
So I think it's a great question, but I think it is complicated because if we think of First Amendment protections, that is person versus government. We want to protect the content of all kinds of speech. Nazis should be allowed to march in Skokie. I should be able to protest on Fifth Avenue. No matter how atrocious or supportive we are of these ideas, they should be free from government interference. But what I think you're getting at is that's not always the paradigm that's relevant for our inquiry in the modern world. A lot of speech happens on privately owned platforms today, social media platforms, on the internet, and those platforms are not regulated the same way the government is. And we do permit certain kinds of restrictions and certain kinds of character and content being censored or being limited in its applicability or ability to spread on these platforms. And I don't know that we have a good answer on that right now. This is the Section 230 debate. I think AI poses an interesting complication, but I don't think it's a fundamentally new one. I think, honestly, actually, the AI piece of it is easier to solve because once you have bots, we have now the Moltbook, a social platform for autonomous agents to interact with each other. And I think we can kind of shunt some of that off to the side and, leave the domain primarily for human engagement. And where it's bots, we can kind of put guidelines to limit the ability of bots to post and speak. And it's not about content restrictions, it's about procedural restrictions. But again, it is something very substantively that troubles, rightly so, a lot of folks.
Yeah. And Barry, please join us in this. And I want to add another complexity. What if it's not a bot on social media? What if it's my robot that I send to Fifth Avenue to hold a sign protesting about whatever? Like, does that robot get free speech because it's my robot?
So the First Amendment jurisprudence is interesting because it focuses both on the right of the speaker to speak and the right of the public to hear messages. So one of the complicated nuances in the famously controversial case of Citizens United, where there was a holding that basically First Amendment rights applied, at least in some cases, to corporate entities, not just to natural persons, was the rationale that it wasn't just about the right of a speaker to speak. It's not that the expressive element is not a core part of First Amendment jurisprudence, the ability of an individual to express themselves, but there's also an important element of the right of the public to hear messages. And the part of the rationale was that in the modern kind of media economy, part of that right structurally is for spending of funds to amplify a message. It's not just a person speaking on the street corner on Fifth Avenue. So the question would be, is there some sort of an extension to that beyond human persons in a different direction? And I think today the case probably isn't plausibly made that there is some kind of right of that robot to speak or of the right for the people to hear the robot. But could a robot be a means of you exercising your speech? Do you have an extended First Amendment that you, in the same way as that you can get together with other people to put out a message through campaign ads? Might there be a right for you to put out your message through alternative means, such as a robot speaking at Fifth Avenue, or some kind of alternative means of using AI to get out a message? And that might very well be the case already under existing law, that obviously there are time, place, and manner restrictions that are different than speech restrictions. But let's say, would it be constitutional to pass a law saying that you can't have a robot speaking on the street corner, that you have to be speaking yourself, holding up the sign yourself? I don't know. I would think that there would be a legitimate question there. I can't say for sure it wouldn't be constitutional because I think there are plausible arguments why it might be different than in any existing jurisprudence. But I think the right clearly wouldn't be located today in the robot as a system. It would be located in you deploying the robot as a technology. It wouldn't matter if the robot is just repeating your recording, or if you have some kind of really complicated AI system where you have some degree of autonomy as to what it is saying. Let's say if you have advocate bot and you programmed it to advocate for your political views, it wouldn't get any additional rights in and of itself through that at least partial autonomy of its ability to speak than it would if it was just verbatim parroting a message that you had. But it might be that you have an expressive right to use those technologies to communicate your message to the audience.
Yeah, absolutely. And Harris, we'll have you close us off on this point. And I'm curious if you can share some thoughts around the last thing Barry spoke about, which is really like level of autonomousness. Because of
Yeah.
course, I can send my human agent and they can do whatever the heck they want. How does that change?
Okay. To be frank, I haven't quite thought about this area in much detail, but here's some sort of high-level thoughts. We're talking about rights, and in my mind, they're linked with responsibilities, right? So we're talking about rights and liabilities. My inclination, at least at this point in time, in terms of our development and technological development, is that these should always be linked to human beings. So if a human being who develops or deploys a bot, they're the ones who should be responsible for what that bot says. So the bot can say whatever it wants, but if the bot oversteps the line, then they should be responsible for that, even if there is some degree of unpredictability about it. That's my inclination at the moment. I mean, some of the points that have just been mentioned are quite interesting as well, because you talk about US Constitution, and we have the Human Rights Act, Article 10. Everyone has a right to freedom of expression, and the right shall include freedom to hold opinions. Query how can do these AIs, at least again in the current terms of the current development, do they hold opinions? I mean, they can say things, but do they actually hold opinions? And this point that Barry made is also reflected here. Interestingly, it's to receive as well as impart information and ideas without interference. That's just sort of an interesting point, that people have a right to receive information. That's part of that freedom of expression right. But those are my thoughts.
Now, we're quickly running out of time, but it would be malpractice for us not to talk about the last piece here, which is the law's impact on AI and on society. So before we dive into just a couple quick topics here, Ben, when we were doing the prep conversation for this, you referred to the law as scaffolding for society, and I thought that was a really interesting concept. Can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
Yeah, so the law is, generally speaking, a reflection of how we choose to order ourselves. We all agree that we've given up various rights and duties, and we've taken on responsibilities to each other because we all want to live in a productive, civilized civilization free from violence, allowed to innovate and grow. And that scaffolding has generally been built on kind of core assumptions of what the mind, the brain power of civilization is. We were the only sentient species, truly sentient species. We are the drivers of everything. And I think we are going to have to start reckoning with capabilities that I'm not going to get into the whole consciousness or sentience debate. That's, I'm sure, a podcast for another time. That'd be a lot of fun. But they start looking like it and having certain capabilities. And it's pushing us, I think, and I hope, to reevaluate how we have ordered certain things. A lot of the time we've spent today has been looking at how does AI change or impact the way the system works today. We have not really talked about if we had to redesign the system from scratch. We go back to, 1,500 years ago, 5,000 years ago, depending on what your legal tradition is, and write this out from scratch with these brand new capabilities that we have. What does that look like? And how do we think about due process and rights and procedures and the scale and impact and personality of litigation and dispute resolution and legal principles? So that is the kind of really interesting question to me. Where does this go now that we have these really interesting emerging questions that challenge fundamental decisions that have been made on the order of magnitude of thousands of years ago?
Absolutely. So Harris and then Barry, we're going to put you in the hot seat for one of these big legal questions, which is legal personhoods. And we can leave consciousness aside for now and just talk about legal personhood. So the question is, how do we think about legal personhood from the perspective of AI? In the United States, certainly corporations have many rights that would otherwise be associated with rights that a person has. And it certainly seems to me that AI is a lot more like a person than a corporation is. So Harris, starting with you, how should we think about legal personhood?
This thought is generated by a certain sort of religious sensibility, but I don't think AI should be treated as persons. So it may well be that there should be some laws around the treatment of AI as AI, but I don't think we should refer to them or see them as persons. And that, in a nutshell, is really where I'm coming from. I don't think I'm going to want to add to that right now.
Absolutely. And Barry?
So there is a significant difference between a legal person, legal personhood, and personhood in a colloquial or ethical sense. Legal personhood basically means that the law recognizes it as an object and a subject of the law. It doesn't necessarily grant it rights analogous to humans. So, for example, to sue or to be sued, you need to have a status of legal personhood. A house can't sue. A house can't be sued conventionally. There's a concept called quasi in rem or in rem, where you can sue an object. So you can sue a ship or you can sue a property. But generally, to be a party to a lawsuit, to be a party to a contract, there is a legal fiction of legal personhood. I don't think that's what we're talking about here. I think we're talking about, can you have higher ethical personhood, sort of, where it's a rights holder, not as a legal fiction, where basically it's holding the vessel, the interest of rights of some persons. So the legal personhood, the legal fiction of legal personhood in a corporate entity, in a community entity, in a religious entity, whatever it might be, and it goes back actually well earlier than common law, it goes back to Roman law, at least 1,000 years and probably earlier, are holders of rights of people. So if you are a trust, you are holding the right of some future persons, potentially. There are whole, in the common law, complicated jurisdictions of when a right, a contract has to be executable for it to be valid, rule against perpetuities, and every common law lawyer studies these things and gets a headache. Having it be personhood in the more colloquial or ethical sense, not as a legal fiction, but as a substantive reality, I think is a very different discussion. I think it's clearly not the case for any of the AIs that exist today, or probably even anything substantively similar to it. I think it's interesting to think about what it would look like, and what kind of scenario it might be that you would be willing to grant rights in person there. So there is a whole movement, and actually a high school friend of mine is very involved in this movement, to grant personal rights to animals. He's suing on behalf of circus elephants, of owls, and things like that, which seems strange, but at least for certain purposes, they have maybe something closer to persons than legal personhood holders like corporation. Elephant probably can suffer, a corporation probably can't suffer. And if you had an AI system that was capable of suffering, that was capable of such things, which seems science fiction-y, pretty clearly, I would say, doesn't describe today's systems, but it's entirely not obvious that those aren't something that is plausible down the road. What would legal personhood for something like that look like? I think that's a real challenge, because if a synthetic being can have legal personhood, do they have a right to legal equality? Do they just have a right to, not be abused and cruelly treated, like some kind of like animal, welfare, ASPCA, prevention of cruelty in animals type of laws? If you give it real personhood, that would have a troubling implication of equality to people. So could Mark Zuckerberg create 1 billion AI units and then they have a right to vote and he gets to just pick the president? Whoever having the most compute now rule the country? That certainly seems absurd. But if you have a being that is conscious, intelligent, and has human-like attributes, to utterly deny it any sort of rights seems arbitrary as well. So I think it sounds science fiction-like and almost absurd, but I think it is something that we need to start engaging with and thinking about, because the problems are myriad. And the solution is entirely non-obvious, how to non-arbitrarily treat potentially conscious, potentially sentient, feeling beings that are utterly unlike ourselves. There are a lot of philosophical issues that I am engaged with in that subject as well. How do you know what a consciousness might look like that is utterly different than yours? How do I know you're conscious?
Absolutely.
I'm analogizing to myself, basically. and a being that is radically different from ourselves, much more so than any human is from any other human, and probably more
Okay,
than.
Barry. So think about this, right? You talk about rights. What about liabilities? So, how are you going to, you sue a robot for monetary compensation? What they're going to pay you with? I mean, there's a difference there between a corporation and a robot, clearly. What are you going to do? Put them in jail or turn them off? There'll be death penalties for robots. So, how does these things
If you
play
have
out?
if you have a sentient robot, it may be able it presumably will be the sort of being that is capable of owning property. That a core right, at least in the common law system, is the ability to own property. Interestingly, at least in theory, again, it seems obvious, but they have right now agents that are trading cryptocurrencies and trading on the betting markets and doing a better job than the average person.
Well, and
So
I think the important element to add here, and we talked about this in one of our recent episodes of the podcast, is there's a few examples of people marrying an AI bot. And while I think I'm in agreement with the conversation we're having here to say that I don't today believe that today's AI are conscious or even truly sentient, I am sure if we had one of these people who married an AI, they would disagree with us. And they would say that their AI does have this different ability. And the reason this matters is because even if we never answer the question of is AI conscious, AI will soon feel conscious and it will talk to us as if it is conscious. And I think this question is something we all have to continue on. And I will, of course, plug our most popular episode from last year, where we had a rabbi, a priest, and a Buddhist scholar come and discuss the question of consciousness. And it's a really great conversation because they each bring a different perspective based on their faith to how one becomes conscious in the first place, which may have some implications for AI's ability to become conscious. Now, before we run out of time, I do want to ask one more question here. And then, of course, I want to talk about your own personal use of AI briefly. And the last question I want to ask is, what lessons from your faith, from your philosophical traditions, should we be bringing to the law and regulation of AI? As AI rolls into the world over the coming years, as like we were just saying, it feels more and more conscious to us, whether or not it really is. What is one thing that you would bring from your faith for us to consider as regulation or law or guardrails for AI? Maybe Ben, you'll kick us off.
It's a really good question. I would want us to start thinking about how do we provide bi-directional safeguards for how we treat AI? How do we make sure that we're treating them correctly? And how do we make sure that we're avoiding encouraging people to brutalize AI systems and coerce in themselves?
Amazing. That reminds me definitely of the Jewish law of, right, we have to feed our pets before we feed ourselves. There's definitely something in there. Okay, Barry, what about you?
So I think the tension would be between that idea and the kind of concept of B'Tselem Elohim Imago Dei, that we have an obligation to feed our pets before ourselves. We have an obligation to alleviate and prevent Sar Balei Chayim, the suffering of living created creatures. But they are morally on an utterly different level than we are. So how do you provide due rights and consideration potentially to beings that might be capable of thought, of feeling, of suffering, but also preserve the morally unique statuses of created human beings that are created in the image of the divine, that have a unique moral stature, moral standing among all other creation? And I think that's a tension that, a significant portion of users of the first chatbot system, Eliza, in the 1960s, believed it was conscious. At your point that whether or not it is, and today I think it pretty clearly isn't, a significant portion believe it today, and a higher proportion will believe it as its capabilities increase, whether or not that's the case. But if it is actually the case that at some point it gets capabilities of sentience, of consciousness, that problem, I think, becomes manifestly more difficult and troubling. How do you give due consideration and ethical engagement to that, prevent moral brutalization and coarsening of ourselves, but also preserve the unique privileged moral status of the created human person?
Absolutely. And Harris?
Okay, I think two things from me. They're picking up themes that I mentioned earlier. I think number one is the idea of having a human judge. So within the Jewish tradition, the judge sits on a beit din, and so the judge is a rabbi. So there's something there in terms of them acting as a role model. This is in the ideal world. I do lots of that didn't work, and they're not always great role models, but this is the hope, at least, right? And Maimonides would say, or says it in his code, for judges should be only men. Okay, we'll have to change this maybe for the modern world, but of wisdom and understanding, of unique distinction in their knowledge of the Torah, and who possess a broad intellectual range. And so, to my mind, the judge is not just someone who reaches for the truth, but someone who should be a role model in society. Plus, the Talmud also talks about judges being in partnership with God when they judges. And the Talmud says in Sanhedrin, and the judges should know whom they are judging and before whom they are judging, and who will ultimately exact payment from them. As it states in Psalms, God stands in the congregation of God. In other words, God is there in the congregation. So there's a sacred role there for the judge. So that's point one. And point two, the other thing I think we can take from religious views is the point that I mentioned earlier, that law isn't just a profession, but it's a devotional exercise. There's obviously a requirement to learn Torah day and night, but there's a specific place for civil law within the Jewish tradition. Rabbi Ishmael says, who wants to become wise? And the answer is he who or she who engages in civil law, the law of damages, because there's no greater part of the Torah than this. It's like an overflowing stream. And, for young lawyers being trained, it's not just a matter of looking through this lens of gaining knowledge, but actually it's a form of societal improvement, which goes far above the individuals or the law firms for whom they work.
I love that. These are three beautiful examples. And really, I'm just so grateful for the work you guys are doing. And I'm so grateful for your time today, because this is really important stuff. Now, before I let you go, I do want to spend just a couple of minutes speaking about your own AI use from a Jewish perspective. So I'll ask each of you to answer these questions. And we're going to start with Harris. We'll go to Barry and then to Ben. So Harris, have you used artificial intelligence in your own personal Jewish observance?
Yes, more recently as a charuta, as a study partner. I do find it incredible, ChatGPT. You drop a text in there and you say, take me through it. I have enough knowledge to know when it's going off-piste. And I think it could be slightly dangerous if you've got no knowledge whatsoever. But for my particular predicament, it's great, right? I know enough to know when it's going wrong and know when it's going right. And then it does teach amazingly.
I love that. Barry?
I think similarly, yeah, that I've used it to kind of help study partially experimentally to see what its capabilities are, partially also to kind of help hone understanding of things, to bring other relevant works in conversation and in context with it. And capabilities are really fascinating. The breadth of knowledge, the scope of it, the ability to engage with obscure, complex passages. It's not always right. It can go off the rails sometimes. But overall, I think analogously to its function in law, it does a remarkable job, particularly for something that is not fine-tunedly trained for that purpose. And also, I want to thank you for your time, for your kind of facilitating and leading this conversation and numerous other fascinating conversations through this platform. It's
very kind. Thank you. Thank you. And Ben, what about your own personal usage?
So I have used it many a time to kind of, for lack of a better or more articulate term, throw stuff at a wall and see what sticks.
Yep.
It is a great partner for just throwing out crazy ideas, vetting them, finding interesting connections, and then you have to go do the homework beyond it. But there are times when you just want to let loose and see what's out there and really kind of get creative and a little bit weird with it.
Absolutely. So we'll go in backwards order now. So you're going to go first, Ben. Where do you see opportunities for other observant Jews to use AI to further some of the core teachings of our faith, like Tikkun Olam, Pikuach Nefesh, Shabbat, and others?
I will be the lawyer and not answer the question that was asked, but a slight tweak on it, which is that I think we all need to learn a lot more and become a lot more comfortable with these technologies. It can be used to achieve tremendous things, from the business side of it, and running and administering an organization, a nonprofit, a shul, whatever it might be. There are intellectual and analytical endeavors that we can pursue with it. But I just think, as a whole, people need to play around with it a lot more, learn what it is, what it isn't, test it, and get more comfortable. It's a tool at the end of the day. And if we don't encourage our community to get much sharper with that tool, we are leaving a lot on the table.
Absolutely. We had a wonderful conversation with a Jewish scholar a few episodes ago where he made the point that if religious communities don't engage, other people will get to make the decisions of how these technologies roll into the world and really encourage us to get engaged. So I love your point there. Barry, how do you think about that?
I will also answer a partially eliding question, but I think a really important aspect of what we do with AI and faith, and I think what faith communities need to engage in more, both my community specifically as an Orthodox Jew, but I think faith communities at large is engaging with the development, the direction, and the governance of these technologies more broadly, because a lot of the discourse in the development and deployment of these technologies is taking place from kind of a pretty narrow, myopic, which is not to critique, every perspective is narrow, myopic in and of itself, but not representative of the broader discourse of the broader world. Most people in the world are people of faith, have faith as a core part of their ethical identity, of their self-conception. Most of the people who are developing these technologies and kind of directing their course of development, their course of engagement, their course of deployment, are coming from a very different place, from a very different perspective, in a very kind of narrow, postmodern, secular philosophical ethic, I think is essential to the discourse, but it can't be a monolith echo chamber with only one voice heard. Other voices have to participate in the discussion, and I think an essential voice is the kind of chorus of faith communities participating in that discussion, and that's something that I know all of us here are working on, but I think people who are not technologists and entrepreneurs or intellectuals specializing in this field, but regular people of faith should be part of that discussion as well, and should help try to bring that to the fore.
Absolutely. Well, we certainly all agree on that. And then, Harris, I'm going to give you the last word for today. What are the lessons that the AI community can learn from Judaism? What can Judaism teach us to bring AI into the world in a way that's pro-human and pro-humanity?
Well, firstly, I think what I think religions are particularly good at, I think Judaism is particularly good at, is instilling virtue through ritual, and therefore instilling virtue that we need to confront and integrate AI well into our lives. One of our big USPs is also knowing when to stop, and I think Shabbat is a major factor in this. Where do we draw the lines, and to create spaces where we don't have AI, so we can, a place to stand, and we can look back at what we created and see if it's good or bad, and where we want to take it next. So I think that's another very important element, and I think I'll end on that point. Gilad, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely, guys. I am so grateful for you being so generous with your time with us today, and of course with this important work you do. And most of all, I want to thank our AI and faith community for continuing to engage in these important topics. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to our podcast. Stay tuned to listen to more conversations and interviews with experts from around the world. In the meantime, follow and rate our podcast on your favorite podcast platform and share it with your friends. Don't forget to follow us on social media. We are on LinkedIn, X, and Blue Sky. Thank you for joining us.